Alright guys, so let's talk about the sheer insanity of everything. The semiconductor war is getting worse, decoupling is not stopping, and China is about to retaliate. They are being pushed to the brink. For over 2 years, President Biden he has been waging a non-stop chip war on China. Now this doesn't just involve US companies like Nvidia stopping their exports, but also ordering US allies to punish Beijing. And China has had enough. They have issued an ultimatum to Japan if they comply with US sanctions. If Tokyo Electron further restricts their sales and servicing of their chipmaking equipment, Beijing will punish Japan's industries. And this is frightening for Japan. Their manufacturing is still contracting and China's retaliation could very well be the death blow. It's important to realize that US restrictions have not halted China's development of all the more advanced chips. We have a new report that tells us their advancement is actually faster than all expectations. China's chip capabilities are just 3 years behind the world leader, TSMC. US curbs are not working. It's only making Chinese engineers work harder and push past their limits. Raimondo, Biden, and Sullivan, they are the biggest benefactors to China's tech progress. If decoupling never started, China would have never made such massive progress in such a short amount of time. The report comes from a Japanese semiconductor research company, and they found something surprising. China's foundry SMIC can only mass produce 7nm chips for now, while TSMC can produce 5nm chips and better. The smaller the chip, the better the performance. However, under various tests, the Chinese Kirin chip has similar performance levels to the Taiwanese variation, and Huawei phones are equipped with this new advanced chip. While Taiwan still has a better production yield and efficiency, it's just a matter of time before the gap is bridged. The more the G7 punishes China, the faster they will reach parity in semiconductor advancement. For US allies like the Netherlands and Japan, this really poses a big problem. The clock is ticking. They will eventually build their own chip making gear, and this means Chinese lithography machines as well. And here's a brilliant explanation by US scientist Steve Su on why it's inevitable. It's just a matter of time.
However, once we Americans started the stupid chip war, we basically showed all these Chinese companies that they're at risk, that they could just be sanctioned, and all of a sudden they would lose access to, Applied Materials or to ASML or Tokyo Electron. So basically, that created an incredible opportunity for all the startups in China to basically ship their products, to sell their products within that domestic market, which by itself is something like 30+% of the global chip market. And so it just suddenly created it solved a coordination problem among all these different Chinese companies where they just realized we're all in it together. It would be foolhardy for even the guys at the top of the food chain, like SMIC or Huawei, it would be foolhardy for them to rely now on foreign vendors that the US could just sanction and remove from the completely bar access to their products. So basically now it's created an integrated ecosystem within China.
Now, it might be 5, 10, or 20 years down the line, but once they do, they will drive down the prices and compete with Tokyo Electron and ASML. Now, in the immediate term, Japan is facing the wrath of China. If Tokyo bows down to the US, Beijing could retaliate. One big concern is China cutting away Japan's access to critical minerals for their automotive production. Companies like Toyota could suddenly face an embargo of critical inputs to make their cars. So we are witnessing the chips war spilling over towards automakers. Japan's EV advancement could grind to a halt if China turns the screws. Toyota is Japan's most important company. If they can't make the transition to electric vehicles, it will be a disaster. They will eventually lose global market share to companies like Tesla and BYD. The company is worth nearly $300 billion. Toyota is Japan's biggest company by market cap, larger than even Sony and their largest financial institutions put together. They produce around 10 million vehicles a year, but Toyota is way behind in the EV game. Imagine the devastation if they can't make the leap. This is a real threat because China has a stranglehold on the automotive supply chain. Toyota might be selling a ton of cars to the US market today, but they will eventually lose the EV market to Tesla over there. There's nowhere to hide if China punishes them. To make an electric car, you need a ton of critical minerals. It's a completely different game from conventional vehicles. You need 6 times the mineral input, and this includes lithium, nickel, cobalt, and most importantly, graphite. And guess who controls the supply chains of these minerals? Once again, it's China. Manufacturing in Japan is very expensive. Energy costs are through the roof, and the weak yen is just making imports very costly. Beijing squeezing critical minerals for EV production will only make things worse. And let's just focus on one critical mineral, graphite. China controls 75% of its mining and over 70% of its commercial production. If Japan gets slapped with an export ban of graphite, Toyota will have to source this mineral elsewhere, and this will drive costs to the moon. Now look at the rest of the EV supply chain. From lithium to cobalt to batteries, China's dominance is clear. Graphite is just one mineral that Beijing can restrict. There are so many other games that can be played. And that's why it's so bizarre why Japan would even consider following US orders to contain China. Almost half of Tokyo Electron's revenue comes from the Chinese companies, and Toyota needs Beijing for EV advancement. It doesn't really make sense. It will only harm Japan's industries and manufacturing future. In today's economy, everything can be weaponized. Financial reserves can be confiscated, interest rates can destroy currencies. And when it comes to supply chains, China is well ahead of the G7 here. They can drive up the cost of production and hence inflation in Western economies. And that's why it's very weird that another manufacturing giant, South Korea, is considering following the US. They might join the coalition to contain China. South Korea's trade minister just dropped a bombshell straight from the Twilight Zone. He wants US carrots or incentives for embracing US policy against Beijing. South Korea is seeking incentives to restrict advanced semiconductor exports to China. Now, I don't think this is a good idea, and here's what the trade minister said. For countries or companies trying to comply with the US in good faith, there should be some kind of carrots. We have no idea what these incentives are, but can they even counter the potential economic damage to South Korea? I think it's very important for countries to understand the end game of the chip restrictions on China. Yes, containing China is top of the agenda. The US wants to delay the rise of Beijing. But that's not really the end goal. The final mission is to reshore chip production back to the US. And this should be crystal clear to everyone by now.
We're back. America's back. We're going to lead the world. There's everything we're talking about in the Chips and Science Act is going to be made in America, produced made in America, create thousands of good paying jobs, investing literally hundreds of billions of dollars. We used to lead the world in semiconductors and computer chips. We're going to do it again. And I'm more optimistic about America's prospects than I've ever been in my whole career.
Well, you heard it from President Biden. He wants semiconductors to be made in America. Getting chips from your allies might be good. However, if the global semiconductor industry reshores to the US, it's even better. That means a ton of jobs created on American soil. So we can expect the Trump or Harris camp to continue this policy as well. It won't just suddenly stop at the end of Biden's term. Nord Stream is a perfect example. After it blew up and took away Germany's supply of cheap Russian gas, the country began to deindustrialize. As a result, German companies are moving out of Germany, and the shift to the US is breathtaking. In 2022, German companies invested $8 billion into the US. Just last year, this amount jumped to over $15 billion, nearly twice the amount. Why? Because the US can give a ton of subsidies to lure companies over. And this allows the US to reindustrialize at the expense of their allies' economies. It's really a zero-sum game. Someone will win, someone will lose. There is a finite amount of demand in the world and goods that can be sold. Supply and demand is not infinite. In 2023, German companies moved in droves to the US. Volkswagen invested $2 billion and Mercedes did the same as well. In total, that created 6,000 jobs in the US. It's one big relocation of labor and America is the big winner. This is the risk that South Korea could face down the road. The semiconductors under threat are memory chips in this case. The US is trying to pressure the Koreans to stop selling their high bandwidth memory chips or HBMs to Chinese companies. HMBs are needed to run AI accelerators and machines from Nvidia and AMD. South Korea has more or less cornered the market here. Almost 3/4 of the memory chip market belongs to two South Korean companies. Samsung sold $22 billion worth and SK Hynix comes in at $16 billion. Micron Technology is a US company and they sold $12 billion. These three companies dominate the landscape here. There's very little Chinese competition around, which means China is buying a ton of memory chips from these companies. The issue here is the financial damage US restrictions can really cause. Just like Tokyo Electron and ASML, the Chinese market is huge for Samsung and SK Hynix. The numbers are simply jaw-dropping. For Samsung, China accounts for 30% of their HBM chip revenue in the first half of the year. That's an incredible chunk for one single market. Sure, Samsung sells a lot more than just memory chips, but losing this will hurt the company's bottom line. And for SK Hynix, Chinese revenue is even more critical to them. Revenue from China jumped by over 100% in the first half of the year to 8.6 trillion won, and that accounted for 30% of their entire revenue, everything. SK Hynix sells mainly memory chips, so the dependency on China here is very real. This begs the big question: what kind of carrots can the US provide to make up for this lost revenue? Will they soak up the missing Chinese demand? Will they pay a premium for the chips to compensate the companies for the trouble? All these are big questions, but I don't think that the US will give an ironclad guarantee here. They will just leave South Korea to sink or swim. There's an even bigger risk in this saga. If South Korea pulls away their supply of chips to China, what will it do? It will just spark a national push from Beijing. The Chinese government will inject billions of dollars once again in subsidies and conduct another session of Hunger Games to develop their own memory chip companies. There's already demand in China for locally made semiconductors. The Pura 70 is Huawei's latest flagship smartphone and is fast becoming a device fully made in China. Their memory chip already comes from YMTC, a local Chinese company. Yes, it's a NAND storage chip, making it less efficient than DRAM from Korean suppliers, but it's a generational improvement from the company's previous chips. Give Huawei 5 years or less and we'll see smartphones with components entirely from China. And when that happens, it's over for chip suppliers like South Korea. So be careful for what you wish for. Joining the US to contain Beijing sounds great. You might very well get the carrots you are looking for, but you'll just trigger Chinese companies to develop their own alternatives. And once that happens, you'll lose the biggest domestic chip market in the world. But let me know what you think. Will Japan risk retaliation with China? Or will the US give their allies carrots to contain China? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.